Good morning, everybody. If you had turned on your television on September 8 in 1966, you would have seen a program that had a 5-year mission to boldly go where no man had gone before. Well, that 5-year mission lasted for 3 years, and the program, of course, was Star Trek. One of the earliest TV programs to deal with outer space was Space Patrol in the early 1950s. They had a captain and a sidekick and traveled throughout the galaxy fighting the bad guys. Here's a comic book version of it. And interestingly enough, a lot of the bad guys had Russian-sounding last names, so appropriate for the Cold War era. Buck Rogers had been a radio program. It had been a comic book. And it did make it to TV in the 1950s. And interestingly enough, their headquarters was in a cave behind Niagara Falls. But they would travel through the galaxy fighting bad guys, and here they have very cool outfits. The British had a puppet show for kids. It was called Fireball XL5. That was the name of their spaceship. And it traveled through the galaxy fighting the bad guys. Here you see the puppets on their spaceship, and you'll notice the robot. And it's interesting looking at the robots through these programs. Some have personalities and so on. The Jetsons was sort of a space-age version of the Flintstones in the early 1960s, and they had all kinds of computer contraptions and aliens. My Favorite Martian, which was on in the mid-60s, featured a Martian who crash-landed on Earth and had all kinds of special powers. He could be invisible. He could read people's minds. And Lost in Space, which featured a family in outer space. It was sort of like the Swiss Family Robinson of the 1800s. They had a really cool robot and a bad guy. You might recall that. Well, here's Gene Roddenberry. He's the creator of Star Trek. He wrote for TV programs in the 50s, and while doing that, met some people who became part of the crew of the Enterprise, like Leonard Nimoy. He'd been influenced by the movie Forbidden Planet from the 1950s, and that had Robbie the Robot, who was kind of a cool robot. He had also been influenced by the novels, first in the 1930s, of Captain Horatio Hornblower, who traveled the world having adventures. And the idea of a space western where you have good and evil fighting each other, kind of like High Noon, except out in outer space. That appealed to Roddenberry, and there's some of that vibe in Star Trek, isn't there? So here it is, September 8, 1966. The crew of the Enterprise, adventures every week, and we learned some things like about beaming up, where Captain Kirk would have Mr. Scott beam him up. And sometimes back then you might hear somebody say, well, I'm going to beam up to wherever they're going to go. Some of the episodes of Star Trek were just downright silly, like this one, the Tribbles, the furry animals that reproduced really fast and ate grain, and if you weren't careful, they were going to take over the spaceship. So that was just kind of dumb, I thought. Here's Captain Kirk talking to Wyatt Earp on the eve of the gunfight at the OK Corral. So some of the episodes had to do with time travel, and can you affect history by affecting what happened in the past. So Leonard Nimoy as Spock was one of the more interesting characters on Star Trek. Here he's showing his hand thing that the Vulcans did. And Leonard Nimoy never really moved beyond Spock, did he? He became Spock for everybody. And some movie stars, as you know, they move on from what made them famous, but Leonard Nimoy kind of embraced Spock, and he did that for his whole life. So the program only lasted for 3 seasons. It was canceled after 3 seasons, but it took on a life of its own. Here's people at a Star Trek convention. Star Trek movies, of course, occurred. And Star Trekkies prevailed upon President Ford to name one of the early models of the space shuttle the Enterprise, and here it is. It wasn't a full-featured space shuttle, but it did have the name. And here are some members of the Star Trek cast at that Enterprise, including Gene Roddenberry in the brown leisure suit. And it reminds us that sometimes life does imitate art, and there really was an enterprise in outer space.